The US just found a way to pay its debt without paying it. Not with spending cuts, not with higher taxes, not with an official default, with a quieter weapon, the dollar itself. Right now, the debt clock is racing toward $38 trillion. And most people are staring at that number like it's the whole story. It isn't. The number is the decoy. The real story is the method being used to make that mountain feel lighter on Washington's back by putting more weight in your hands. And if we don't see the mechanism, we're the mechanism. Let's get into it. Here's the first truth we need to say out loud. The US government can't act like a household. A household hits a limit and stops spending. A government hits a limit and changes the rules of the game. Fact. A massive chunk of federal spending is locked in. Social Security, Medicare, interest on the debt. Those aren't optional line items. They're political landmines. So when interest costs rise, the government doesn't calmly tighten the belt. It borrows more. And that's how you get the loop. Debt creates interest. Interest creates more borrowing. More borrowing creates more debt. That's not a budget problem. That's a treadmill with the speed knob snapped off. Now, watch the trap most people fall into. They hear 38 trillion and assume there must be a why paying the debt normally isn't realistic dramatic fix, a grand reform, a heroic bipartisan plan. But the system can't handle a dramatic fix. Austerity, that's the cut, everything fantasy. It detonates elections, collapses demand, and turns a slowdown into a depression. The US economy is wired to government spending like a patient on an IV. Rip it out fast and you don't get discipline. You get a crash, default. That's the burn it down and restart fantasy. But US treasuries aren't just IUs. They're the base layer of global finance. Banks treat them like oxygen. Pension funds park retirement promises in them. Big institutions use them as collateral to borrow, trade, and settle payments. If that risk-free assumption cracks, the whole credit machine locks up. So we're left with the only option that doesn't cause instant riots, the soft default. The debt gets paid back in full in money that buys less. This is where we need to get precise because the game is played in two dimensions. There's the nominal world, the number printed on the bond, and there's the real world, what that money can actually buy. If we borrow $1 and pay back $1, technically we paid. But if that dollar used to buy a steak and now it buys a packet of ketchup, the lender got robbed politely. That robbery is inflation. And before anyone gets emotional, we separate facts from interpretation. Fact. When inflation runs higher than the interest rate paid on government debt, the real value of that debt shrinks. Interpretation. In a debt-heavy system, that gap isn't a random accident. It becomes the lifeline. This is the whole play. Keep inflation hot enough to melt the debt. Keep rates low enough to keep the interest bill from exploding. Let the calendar do the rest. And don't let anyone sell you the growth will fix it. Bedtime story. Growth helps only if it outruns the debt. But debt doesn't just sit there. It takes a bite every year. Fact. Interest is a claim on future income. Interpretation. The bigger that claim gets, the less room we. The soft default mechanism in simple terms have to invest in the future that creates growth. It's like trying to win a race while carrying a backpack that keeps filling with rocks, and demographics make it worse. Aging populations mean more benefits, fewer workers, and a smaller base to tax. So even if the economy grows, the obligations can grow faster. That's why policymakers don't talk about paying the debt down anymore. They talk about sustaining it. Translation. Keep it rolling, keep it financed, keep the public calm. Now, watch the psychological trick. They'll say, rates are high, so savers are finally winning. But if the cost of living rises faster than the yield on your savings, you're not winning. You're just losing slower. And losing slower still means losing. This is why the system loves confusion. If you're arguing about whether inflation is 3% or 4%, you're missing the only question that matters. Is your money growing faster than your life is getting more expensive? If not, you're paying the bill. And if you want a real early warning, watch what happens when buyers start demanding higher yields at auctions. That's the moment the dam trembles and the system has to choose between pain now or devolution later. Now, pause here and think. If this is the plan, who pays? Because costs don't disappear. They move. And they don't move evenly. The payment doesn't arrive as a tax bill. It arrives as a smaller grocery bag. It arrives as insurance renewals that jump while coverage shrinks. It arrives as rents that climb faster than salaries. It arrives as savings that look bigger on paper but feel smaller in your life. The debt clock spins upward. Your buying power spins downward. That's the exchange. And we need to be honest. This is educational. We manage risk. Now, why does it feel like some people are doing fine while others feel crushed? Because new money doesn't hit the economy like rain. It hits like a fire hose pointed at one end of the room. When deficits run and the system back stops markets, the first receivers aren't workers. They're balance sheets, banks, funds, large corporations. They touch the money before prices fully adjust, so they can deploy it into assets, stocks, real inflation versus interest rates, the real game. Estate, private deals, hard assets. By the time the money reaches wages, the price tag's already moved. So the system creates a timing advantage, and timing becomes inequality. This is why in the same inflation era, we can watch two movies playing at once. One movie, asset holders feel richer. Another movie, wage earners feel poorer. Same economy, different seats. Here's the mistake most people make. They look at inflation like it's a weather event. Inflation happened? No. Inflation is a channel. It's how the debt burden gets shifted off the state and onto everyone holding the currency. It's a tax that doesn't need a vote, and that's why it's so effective, because no politician has to sign their name on it. Now watch what has to happen next, because this is where the system gets clever. If the system relies on inflation to erode the debt, it must stop interest rates from rising to match that inflation. Why? Because if yields rise to the true inflation rate, the government's interest bill explodes. That's not theory, that's basic arithmetic. So the system needs suppressed rates. People hear suppressed rates and think it's a vibe. It's not a vibe. It's survival. Think of it like a dam. The debt is the water pressure. Interest rates are the cracks. Let rates rise too far and the wall breaks. So the policy goal becomes keep the cracks sealed, even if it means flooding the valley downstream. And how do you keep yields pinned when markets want higher returns? You build a captive audience. This is the part nobody says on TV because it sounds boring, but it's the muscle behind the strategy. Banks and institutions don't buy treasuries only because they love them. They buy them because the rulebook makes them. Regulators label treasuries high-quality liquid assets. Translation: if you want to be considered safe, you must hold government bonds. Pension funds need them. Insurance companies need them. Banks need them for liquidity ratios and capital rules. So even when real yields are negative, the system has built in buyers who can't walk away. That's not a free market, that's a forced bid. And when that forced bid isn't enough, that's when the buyer of last resort steps in. And you already know who that is. The central bank, not by announcement, by necessity. If private buyers hesitate, the system floods the market with support, buys the bonds, and keeps yields contained. The language is who pays the hidden bill and how, always soothing. Orderly markets, stability, liquidity. But the action is simple. Keep financing cheap. Keep the debt survivable. Let the currency absorb the pain. Now here's a contradiction that should make you sit up. We're told higher rates are tightening, but if inflation is higher than the yield you earn, the system is still loosening in real terms. That's the trick. They can hike the nominal rate and still keep the real rate below zero. So you feel the pain of higher monthly payments while the debt still melts. That's the double hit. And here's your next clue. Watch the words real yields, because that's the battleground. Real yield is just one thing. The rate you earn minus inflation. If that number stays negative, the state is winning its debt war. If that number turns positive and stays positive, the state starts sweating. Now, why does it feel like official inflation doesn't match what we're living? This is where the story gets uncomfortable. Because measurement itself is a lever. Inflation isn't just a thing you feel. It's a number that determines payouts, social security adjustments, wage negotiations, index payments. If the official print is lower, the government's obligations grow slower. That's not a conspiracy. That's incentives. And incentives are stronger than speeches. Over time, the way inflation is calculated can shift. Substitutions, quality adjustments, category weighting, technical words that sound harmless, but they decide how much your income keeps up and how much it doesn't. So if official inflation is lower than lived inflation, the system quietly undercompensates everyone tied to the official number. And that undercompensation is another form of debt reduction, another invisible payment made by the public. Now, none of this works if people can simply exit the system. If you can step outside, hold value privately, and ignore negative real rates, the machine loses control. So what does a debt-heavy system do? It closes exits slowly, gently, with the language of convenience. Cash is anonymous. Cash is friction. Cash lets you say no quietly. A fully digital money system removes that. Digital money can be tracked, programmed, restricted. And here's the part most people don't want to think about. If money becomes programmable, policy stops being a suggestion. It becomes a command. Negative rates become automatic. Spending can be encouraged by expiration dates. Certain transactions can be real yields, the key signal to watch. Blocked in the name of safety. And the debt strategy becomes easier because participation becomes mandatory by design. Now tell me this, if the state can't cut spending, can't tax enough, can't default, and needs inflation, why would it ever keep the escape hatch open? That's the logic of control, not because someone twirls a mustache. Because the math forces it, and math doesn't care about feelings. We've seen versions of this movie before. When governments come out of massive wars with debt loads that look impossible, they rarely repay in hard money, they cap rates, they tolerate inflation, they push savers into losses, and over a decade or two, the burden shrinks in real terms while the headlines pretend nothing dramatic happened. That's why this strategy is so dangerous. It doesn't feel like an event, it feels like a new normal. And that new normal rewires how all of us behave. Because in a world of negative real rates, being cautious becomes expensive. Savings accounts become slow leaks. Government bonds become polite losses. So the system nudges people into risk, not by force, by design. It turns the economy into a casino where you don't get to choose whether to play. You either take risk or you accept erosion. That's it. This is why housing stops being just housing. It becomes a chip. This is why retirement stops being save and wait. It becomes invest and pray. This is why people feel like they're sprinting on a treadmill that keeps getting faster. We're not imagining it. We're living inside the debt management machine. So what are we really watching? We're watching the debt stop being a problem to solve and become a problem to manage, not eliminate, neutralize. Make it irrelevant by shrinking the value of the unit it's measured in. And that's why the headline number can keep growing. 40 trillion, 50, 60. The number becomes theater. The real battle is the gap between inflation and yields and the degree of control over how we can save, spend, and opt out. Now let's keep this practical without turning it into a sales pitch. We're not gambling, we're measuring. We watch whether inflation stays sticky. We watch whether rates stay politically contained. We watch whether exit options get narrowed. If inflation stays above yields, the debt melts. If yields rise and stay high, the system starts to choke. If exits close, the policy toolbox gets sharper. That's the chessboard, and it leads to the brutal takeaway. The middle class becomes the shock absorber, not because anyone hates the middle class, because the middle class holds the currency, policy tools that keep the system working, holds the savings, holds the fixed incomes, and tries to be responsible. And in this regime, responsible is what gets punished. Cash loses value, bonds lose purpose, savings accounts become slow leaks. So people are pushed into risk assets just to keep up. Life becomes a constant hedge. And that stress you feel, that's not personal failure. That's the system transferring pressure onto households to keep the state stable. So where does this go? It goes until confidence breaks or control tightens enough to keep confidence from breaking. That's the balancing act. Move slow enough that people normalize the loss. Move fast enough that the debt stays serviceable. And never say the quiet part out loud. Because if everyone understood the mechanism at once, the reaction would be violent. People would demand higher wages, investors would demand higher yields, capital would run, and the soft default would turn into a hard crisis. So the system keeps it foggy. Separate the debt conversation from the inflation conversation. Make each price shock feel isolated. Blame supply chains, blame corporations, blame geopolitics. Some of those are real, but the core engine is still running. Underneath, dilute the dollar to dilute the debt. Now before we end, we need one last lens. This isn't about doom, it's about clarity. If we understand the rules, we stop being surprised. We stop making the mistake most people make, sitting in cash, waiting for normal to return while the calendar quietly taxes us every day. And if you want more breakdowns like this, fast, direct, no fluff, hit subscribe. Now answer me in the comments. If this strategy works, what breaks first? Confidence in the dollar or our ability to opt out? And if the government can erase real debt through inflation without voting on a tax, do you think they'll ever choose the painful path again? Or is this the new permanent policy? Keep your eyes on incentives. Keep your eyes on exits. And remember, the debt doesn't disappear. It moves.